The explosive reports of a whistleblower complaint against President Trump is raising more questions than answers. Yamiche Alcindor begins our coverage of this fast-moving story.
A mysterious whistleblower and a president on defense. Today, President Trump was insistent any communications between him and foreign leaders are strictly above board.
I've had conversations with many leaders that are always appropriate, at the highest level, always appropriate.
Sitting next to Australia's Prime Minister in the Oval Office, he dismissed a complaint by an intelligence community whistleblower reportedly aimed at him.
It's just another political hack job. That's all it is.
The Washington Post and New York Times have reported the complaint involves the president's communications with an unspecified foreign leader and other actions, and centers on Ukraine. It is public record that on July 25th, the president spoke on the phone with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. That was 2 weeks before the whistleblower complaint was filed. Today, new reports surfaced that President Trump repeatedly pressed Zelensky to work with his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. The president wanted Hunter Biden's dealings with a Ukrainian gas firm investigated in a bid to aid the Trump re-election campaign. Biden's father, former Vice President Joe Biden, is a potential 2020 challenger to President Trump. On CNN last night, Giuliani first denied it, then admitted it.
Did you ask the Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden?
No, actually, I didn't.
So you did ask Ukraine to look into Joe Biden?
Of course I did.
Giuliani eventually said the president had no knowledge of his actions. But the administration has blocked access to the whistleblower's complaint, setting up a standoff with Congress. In letters released Thursday, the Intelligence Community Inspector General called it an urgent concern related to serious or flagrant abuse that he said should be given to lawmakers. Michael Atkinson also testified behind closed doors before the House Intelligence Committee. But he said he was barred from revealing the substance of the whistleblower's complaint. Committee chair, Democrat Adam Schiff, said he may sue to access it.
Given the Inspector General said this is urgent, it can't wait.
In a statement today, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said all of this raises, quote, grave, urgent concerns for our national security. Those concerns will get an airing next week. On Wednesday, President Trump is scheduled to meet with President Zelensky. The next day, Acting Director of National Intelligence, Joseph McGuire, is set to testify before the House Intelligence Committee. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Yamiche Alcindor.
To provide insight on how the Ukrainian government is factoring into all this, I'm joined by Nina Jankowicz of the Wilson Center, an independent, nonpartisan research institute. Nina Jankowicz, welcome back to the NewsHour. So now we have this new information, the Wall Street Journal reporting that President Trump repeatedly pressured the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son. What is the Ukrainian government saying?
The Ukrainian government has been very deft in their avoidance of this issue, which I think is intentional. They're trying to kind of walk a thin line of not really upsetting anyone in the Trump administration or a potential next president. And in a readout of the call from July 25th, they said that President Trump discussed anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine that have been stalling U.S.-Ukrainian relations, perhaps a nod to this scandal that has come up recently.
Could be seen as a reference to that. But so if the government is not commenting officially, what are people around his administration saying?
Well, I think anti-corruption activists in Ukraine, which represent a very strong and vibrant portion of civil society, are saying, you know, they're pretty bemused that Viktor Shokin, this prosecutor general who is involved in this scandal, is being championed by Rudy Giuliani and the Trump administration as some sort of anti-corruption crusader. Actually, he was an obstacle to anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. And the fact that the Trump administration is trying to paint this as, you know, a sacking for Hunter Biden's own protection is just not really ringing true with the Ukrainians who are closest to the material.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about, because President Trump keeps saying the news media needs to investigate what happened with regard to this prosecutor, and you're saying people there don't see there's anything to that.
Right. They say that claim doesn't hold water, that Joe Biden asked former President Poroshenko to fire Viktor Shokin in order to protect his son. Actually, these anti-corruption activists are saying by firing Viktor Shokin, Biden was almost certainly inviting more investigation into his son, because this former prosecutor had been stonewalling anti-corruption investigations.
So the plot thickens. And meantime, Nina Jankowicz, there's this question of the fact that these conversations between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine were taking place around the same time the administration was about to say it was going to deliver foreign aid to Ukraine. How does that factor into all this?
Well, the delivery of military assistance to Ukraine was one of the Ukrainian government's top diplomatic priorities over the past 5 years. As a reminder, there is a hot war on in Europe. Ukraine has been resisting Russian aggression for the past 5 years, and this military assistance is very much needed and very important to Ukraine. The fact that over the past couple of weeks it was frozen for reasons unknown to the Ukrainian government, not related to any reform efforts, seemingly out of the blue, was really seen as a shock in Kyiv.
So does this, what we're learning today and yesterday, is that are people now putting some puzzle pieces together and to suggest that there's a connection?
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like maybe the Trump administration was considering withholding this aid in order to pressure the Zelensky administration into opening or reopening this investigation into Biden and the company, the gas company that he was working with. And that's extremely troubling to me because Ukraine is a democratic beacon for millions of people in the former Soviet space. They just had a very historic election in the spring in which Russians were saying, when are we going to have an election like that? And we should be supporting this new administration, building bridges with them, not burning it down.
And just quickly, what is the overall impression of President Trump among Ukrainians at the high levels there?
I think it's confusion. It's one of confusion. On the one hand, he has delivered this military assistance package that for a long time the Ukrainian administration could not get under President Obama. But on the other hand, they have these crazy mixed signals coming from the president's personal lawyer.
Well, it's quite a story, and we're going to continue to follow it, and I know you're going to continue to
Absolutely.
as well. Nina Jankowicz, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.